In spending the last year or so discussing games, I've come to realize how much I appreciate the horror genre. I've talked in most of my videos about the idea of games being more than rote mechanical exercises, where design and artistry can come together to make something uniquely memorable. In writing this so many times, I kept on thinking back to games like Dead Space and Resident Evil, where the most difficult choices were the ones happening purely in my head, trying to optimize my route through a dangerous area, or considering what items to sell and which to keep. And these choices are elevated because of how they intersect with each other. Limited inventory space requiring you to make nerve-wracking treks through old areas, or simplistic gunplay made all the more exciting when you scored the perfect headshot. However, despite my enjoyment of horror games and the tense decision-making they offer, I've also learned to brace myself for what I've learned is another constant for the genre: a disappointing ending.
I'm red fuel.
So it usually works like this: the first half, fantastic. The next 40% solid, but a slight decline. And then somewhere in that last 10%, the game seems to forget everything that made it so compelling and just disintegrates. And while the effect is the same, there are actually a variety of reasons why so many horror games end so poorly. Some attempt to switch gameplay styles at the last possible minute, while others staunchly adhere to the trappings of gaming at large, even when it hurts the quality of the game as a whole. And it's a shame. So many of these titles demonstrate a real understanding of the medium in the opening hours, where supplies are limited and the player and the protagonist are almost one and the same, fumbling with the controls and nervously expecting something to jump out of the shadows. In considering all this, I went back to some old favorites and some titles I had never played, in the hopes of figuring out why so many horror games end so poorly, and more importantly, if anything could be done to remedy this problem. Something that strikes me as to why endings are generally so disappointing is that the beginnings of many horror games are near transcendent. Take the Resident Evil 2 remake or Resident Evil 7, where the early hours are spent in these deadly labyrinths, finding keys, supply caches, and working up the courage to brave a particularly nasty room. These early sections are also notable for having a pursuer enemy, one that's basically invulnerable, so all you can do is get as far from it as possible. It both stresses your knowledge of the environment and tests your last few hours of decision making. Did you clear a potential escape route of enemies, or take enough healing items to survive a near-fatal hit? This is what I mean, elements of the game elevating each other, where seemingly simple systems are made more engaging. Just as you start to realize how small the RCPD is, Mr. X shows up to turn this once overwhelming location into an hours-long game of hide-and-seek. Here's the problem. This dynamic isn't replicated in any of the later locations. Progress further into either game, and each area is more linear than the last, until you're shooting molded, one at a time at the bottom of a salt mine, or waves of zombies in a sterile cafeteria, without any of the additional considerations of exploration or a looming danger to prop it up. Where the shooting mechanics shine are when you're debating how to dispatch enemies, weighing if it's better to go for a costly headshot, or to shoot out a leg to make repeat trips safer, maybe even opting to spare ammo, and sneak around as you hear some ominous footsteps in the distance. As both games go on though, the shooting mechanics that are tuned for some anxiety-inducing combat are pushed to the forefront, their latter halves too comfortable to throw hordes of enemies at you. Now, I think there's a reason for this, and that's to create a sense of catharsis. After hours avoiding enemies, and presumably dying to them, it should be a relief to have the firepower and knowledge needed to confront them. But all too often this feeling is compromised by transitioning into a combat system that's ill-suited for all-out action. It's one of the more striking problems of the RE2 remake, with almost every boss encounter turning into a flailing mess that demands mostly shooting its very obvious weak points. It's so far removed from the complexity of the opening hours of the game, and far less compelling to overcome. And this is a trend of many weak endings, where the final moments whittle down the game until it's left with nothing but its most basic mechanics. For example, RE7 is the first mainline entry to incorporate a first-person perspective, alongside the ability to block. It's also a title very much about scavenging, and most of the bosses throughout the game stress some sort of environmental awareness, whether that means noticing a conveniently placed chainsaw or a stray set of car keys. It's a bit of a shame then that the final boss tests none of these elements, outside of having to block at the appropriate time, and what you're left with is a hulking monstrosity that feels totally divorced from the rest of the game. Maybe this speaks to my own ineptitude, but I'm not even sure if it really matters what you do during this fight, as the game is more concerned with making sure that you grab the pistol needed to trigger the final cutscene. It feels like it invalidates any of the planning and preparation you've done up until this point. A fight that's essentially self-contained, and I imagine exists because of a perception that ending on something less bombastic wouldn't suit such a long-running franchise. It's a bit deflating to realize that the last test of your accumulated skill and gear is fighting two bloated molded in what is a fairly dull environment. I view this as another failed attempt at catharsis, but sometimes the opposite is true, as with the original F.E.A.R. F.E.A.R. is a game perhaps best known for its artificial intelligence, where the tension is mostly derived from the sense that you're fighting an opponent with a sense of self-preservation, that's willing to adapt to the situation it's in. And while the idea of fighting a bunch of guys with guns probably sounds anathema to creating an effective horror experience, I was surprised upon replaying it that I was so on edge throughout. These aren't enemies you can get complacent around. Years of military shooters have trained me to stay in cover and wait for some dude in a balaclava to break from cover and rush in a suicidal charge, but that sort of thinking will get you killed fairly quickly. I had a number of instances where my instinct of waiting for an enemy to run through a doorway ended with me jumping out of my seat when they instead flanked around or tossed a grenade. This intelligence, combined with the player character's ability to slow time and move like they're in a John Woo film, make for some exhilarating and demanding fights. So, with all that said, how do you think it ends? Okay, whatever you came up with just now is automatically better than how it actually ends. After hours of fighting a surprisingly human enemy force, who flank, suppress, and fight as though their lives depend on it, you enter the endgame area and fight the lamest enemies imaginable. It's like it thinks the way to end is by replacing the clone enemies you've been fighting with ghosts, because ghosts are obviously scarier than humans, and instead of being another dynamic enemy, the game just spawns them in front of you, like you're in a shooting gallery. Like the ending of RE7, the final hours are both deflating and feel like something of a betrayal. Not only is shooting ghosts a miserable way to end the game mechanically, it seems more like a choice made out of obligation to the genre, trying to derive fear from a more traditional source rather than looking at the mechanics and scenarios unique to F.E.A.R. itself. Maybe ratchet up the tension in the final encounter, having the player fight a tough group of enemies, only without the aid of your slow-mo powers. Or make it appear as though you've completed your mission and averted the crisis, only to remain stuck in the stop time, the point man forever trapped in a frozen world. I guess maybe there is an underlying problem that connects these titles, a sense of obligation. That your horror game either needs to pivot into being an action game in its final moments, as with the RE titles, or to attempt to disempower the player, as with F.E.A.R. And more often than not, that's why these games end so poorly, as they attempt to cap off a given experience with a finale that will match the audience's expectations, rather than remain faithful to the work itself. It's all the more annoying when the potential for a quiet, tragic ending is upended in favor of something far more bombastic and far less impactful. Dead Space 2 is a game about dismembering enemies. It's also a game about dealing with trauma, the guilt that can come with survival. I'd argue that only one of these can be dealt with in the game itself. The other should be the realm of narrative scenes, something that Isaac has to confront internally, rather than by shooting it until it dies. Even taken on its own, this battle at the center of the mind doesn't even serve as a final test of the mechanics on offer, where the regenerator chase that comes immediately before the ending at least stresses target prioritization and your ability to immobilize enemies. You're actually better served in the mental battle by just shooting the massive glowing weak spot, and forgetting all about the other enemies in the arena. Not only is it a tactless way of showing Isaac reconciling with his past, it's a poor mechanical send-off for the game. Honestly, if the final encounter was Isaac finally escaping the regenerator, and then confronting the vision of Nicole in a cutscene, my final memories of the game would be much fonder. It would mean not having a 30-second chunk of gameplay, but would have meant that the last bit of gameplay actually had you engaging with the core mechanics, and could have allowed for a scene with more nuance than, well, shooting a screaming ghost and accompanying shadow babies until the giant pulsating weak spot reveals itself. As unsatisfying as it might have been on a design document, I think it would have left a better impression than making something so contrived. While it's not the end of the game, the Resident Evil remake has a very similar moment. Throughout the game you have encounters with a twisted monstrosity named Lisa Trevor, the remains of one of Umbrella's early experiments that still wanders the mansion's grounds. She's impervious to gunfire and can hit fairly hard, but I'd be hard-pressed to call her scary. The more you learn about her, and her creation, the more pitiable she becomes, as she still retains some of her humanity despite her monstrous form. When you encounter her later in the game, I was really impressed with the restraint the developers displayed. You don't get the serious staple of an exciting boss fight, just a small area where you have to avoid her while completing a simple puzzle. The idea that she was stuck down there, doomed to this half-life, was haunting. Something much more memorable than just beating her in a boss... Oh. So no, you actually do fight her, as she suddenly sprouts tentacles and then you're pushing off these weights to open a coffin while Barry distracts her before she jumps off into the void. What? I could go on. I finished Silent Hill 2 earlier this year, and despite the strength of the game at large, the absurdity of the final boss, where you run circles around your wife bed, undercut the impact of the prior hours. It does feel kind of a shame that one of my defining memories is of this totally superfluous fight, one that, surprise surprise, seems added because you have to end your game with a boss fight. Again, it's a game where the ending would have benefited from being more subdued, maybe confronting Maria in a cutscene before simply walking out of town to whatever ending you've earned, mirroring the opening's ominous walk into Silent Hill. In games that so revel in twisting and corrupting the human form, maybe it's only natural that I'm more aware of these sections, as they feel like vestigial growths in their respective games. These are some of the greats of the genre, even the medium at large, so don't let that discourage you from trying them, but I hope it's become clear that a disappointing ending is almost as much an expectation for me with horror games as jump scares or inventory management. It also makes it all the more surprising when a horror game does end well, and where many of the prior games seem like they forgot why they work at the last second, these titles push their strengths to the forefront in their closing hours. The ending of Manhunt is harrowing and gross and a little janky, and I love it. After a game of being thrust into the starring role of a snuff film, you finally manage to sneak into the mansion of the film's director. You dispatch the mercenaries that guard the estate, which is terrifying in its own right, and then you're about to finally confront the director, before being trapped in the attic with Pigsy, an obese killer armed with a chainsaw and wearing nothing but a pig mask. To make matters worse, you lose all your equipment prior to the fight, and so have to scrounge for one-use weapons to slowly take him down. It's something of a callback to the early tutorial levels, where there was a real tension in outmaneuvering enemies and trying to pick them off as quietly as possible. But it's profoundly more tense in this moment, as you have to avoid something far more disturbing than the various goons of the early hours. The ending even manages to provide some catharsis, letting you use Pigsy's chainsaw to eviscerate the last few guards before turning the director into a bloody pulp. It's a fine line, but Manhunt manages to provide this brief jolt of terror and action in its final minutes, capturing the emotional range of the entire game, as you transition from prey to predator. Little Nightmares is probably the biggest outlier of the bunch, more akin to cinematic platformers such as Another World or Limbo than the more systems-driven fear of the games I've discussed. At the same time, having to outrun the monstrous inhabitants of the world for fear of being gobbled up was consistently nerve-wracking, and the game is clever enough to combine these two elements, this fear of being out in the open, and this idea of consumption in its ending. After beating the lady in a fairly easy encounter, we see our character begin to devour her corpse. This would be shocking enough, but it's the moment of gameplay afterwards that cemented the ending in my mind. A walk through the middle of the dining hall that the player will have previously been darting through. Here, in this final scene, you don't have any gameplay concerns other than moving the character forward, seeing the grotesque patrons lean in to devour our character, before suddenly falling over, dead, the girl having inherited some of the lady's supernatural power. There's a feeling of relief and dread that permeates this scene, as, on the one hand, it's great seeing the various patrons get their just desserts, while on the other, it's hard not to view this shift in power dynamic as menacing, and it's unclear if the girl's actions are a meaningful change or simply mean that there's a new boss at the top of the food chain. This scene only lasts about a minute and is no more mechanically demanding than tilting the left stick forward, but it's a far more effective and thematically appropriate way of capping off the game, something both empowering and darkly memorable. I suppose if we're getting towards the ending of a video talking about endings, then why not end with ZombiU? The concept itself is simple enough, playing as a survivor completing various objectives and scavenging for supplies in a zombie-infested London, relying mostly on your ever-durable cricket bat and the guidance of the Prepper, an enigmatic survivalist who guides you throughout London over the radio. There's a catch though. If your character dies, that means you have to play as a new character with a scant few supplies, and have one chance to make it back to where you died, your previous character holding onto all your gear, albeit now in a slightly decayed state. It's a fairly good time for the most part, pushing into different neighborhoods, scavenging where you can, and trying to overcome the hordes of zombies that fill the streets. And then you get to the final stretch, where a prompt pops up to tell you that this is it. Die any point before escaping London and you lose all your progress. No run to your gear or new character showing up at a safe house. Dying here means the game is over. Your next shot at escape will mean starting a new game entirely. It's not as harsh as it sounds, the game is only a few hours long, but the tension is unreal. Death comes fairly easily in ZombiU, and the threat of losing a given character is already stressful enough. The ending magnifies this tenfold, tasking you with journeying across the city to complete the last few objectives, while you get whittled down to the last few supplies you stored throughout the game. It's one of the few games where my decisions early on felt like they rippled throughout the game, and I felt a tangible sense of regret at my early game moments spending ammo so callously. In this final sequence, ZombiU is putting you through one hellish test of your knowledge of the entire game. Instead of coming up with, say, a giant zombie or a group of rival survivors to face off against as a half-assed boss fight, this final sequence draws from the core mechanics to make a truly thrilling ending. Making it out of London on my last bit of health, staving off the last waves of zombies with what remained of my supplies, is one of the greatest feelings of triumph and relief I've had in a game, and it's all owed to the gauntlet that is the ending. These examples illustrate how a horror game can end, by finding new ways to iterate on the mechanics and sensibilities that make it scary, or by ending in a way that leaves the player with a disturbing final memory, even if it means shirking how a game should end. At the same time, I know I've been quite critical of most of the games I've discussed, using them as examples of how many titles are unable to stick the landing. While I stand by that, I also want to make it clear that this is not some complete failure on the part of the developers. When half your team leaves midway through development, or you use your mainstay franchise as a chance for everyone involved to pitch their own ideas, as happened with Dead Space 2 and Resident Evil 7, my feeling almost becomes inverted. More impressed by how high the highs were up to that point, and how cohesive the bulk of the game managed to be. I imagine most, if not all the games on this list, went through hell to get out the door, and that the grievances I've been discussing were just as felt by the development team, and not quite the revelations that I might hope they are. But it does feel like a chronic problem with the genre, and I hope I've shown how many endings falter, and given some examples of how the best endings can house some of the most nerve-wracking and unsettling moments of their respective games. As paradoxical as it sounds, I'd relish the chance to play a game where its ending was almost too terrifying to finish. Thanks for watching.